Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome back to Lost in Adaptation and my look at how loyally the makers of the 2010 film Scott Pilgrim vs. the World adapted it from the 6 comic books it's based on. Okay, so I blurted out the general plots of at least 2 volumes now, so before we move on to volume 3, I just want to let it be known that if you wish to take a break here in order to give yourself a chance to experience them for yourself before continuing with these reviews, I wouldn't take it as an affront to my YouTube video making abilities. The amount of time allocated to each novel drops sharply here, with this one making up an estimated 9% of the film's runtime minus the end credits. This isn't hugely surprising, as the further we go into this series, the less likely it is that the book they were working on would have been entirely finished. However, it's not just about how long they spent on each novel. It's hard but not impossible to condense a story while still holding true to its core narrative and messages. Let's take a look at the corresponding part of the film and the comic to see if they managed to pull that off. After their performance, Envy requests that Scott and his friends join them backstage, where everyone glares at each other and trades thinly veiled insults, except for Knives, who is just so happy to be in the room with her favourite band and personal idol. Until she accidentally annoys her, so she has her boyfriend punch her so hard the highlights fly out of her hair. Envy and Todd then continue to goad Scott and Ramona until he can't take it anymore and attacks him, only to discover he has telekinetic powers due to being a vegan. The logic apparently being that meat or dairy products will clog up the untapped potential of the human brain, so only vegans can enjoy ultimate power. You know, I have to say this completely destroyed my suspension of disbelief in regards to this film. I mean, a vegan who doesn't bring up the fact that he is vegan in conversation until it becomes relevant to do so? Ludicrous! Take that, vegans and your economically sustainable healthy diets. Scott fails to defeat Todd in combat, then fails to defeat him in a base battle, but manages to trick him into drinking coffee with real milk in it by using his telepathic abilities against him, making him believe the milk was in another cup. The, vegan authorities show up and reveal that this was his 3rd strike, having knowingly eaten chicken and not knowing the gelato he ate was made of milk and eggs. They strip him of his vegan powers, which gives Scott the opportunity to headbutt him so hard that he dies. Envy is somewhat upset by this, but Scott calling her Natalie seems to stir memories inside her of a time before she was a total bitch. Afterwards, the gang goes for pizza, Steven Stills tries to convince everyone to go to the gig's after party, and Scott seems to have finally had enough of this evil ex's bullshit. And that is all we have for this volume's time in the film. I did warn you it was shorter, but fear not, there's plenty to talk about in regards to the comic. While waiting for Envy in the venue after closing time, Scott notices a save point in the corner, but doesn't quite get to it in time before his ex turns up. Backstage, there's a lot of awkward silences broken by the occasional greeting, and Knives' timid attempts to get her senpai to notice her. Envy and Todd throw a few complex salts at their exes, then Knives draws just a little too much attention to herself, and Envy has her band's drummer, Lynette, punch the highlights out of her hair with her biotic arm, then, despite Knives' pleas to be allowed to remain, banishes her from the room. Envy continues to be a total bitch to Ramona until Scott can't take it anymore, though as he has a strict policy of not hitting women, he settles for trying to attack Todd instead. However, vegan, telekinetic powers, brain not clogged with stuff, blah blah blah, Scott gets thrown through a wall. Envy makes the surprising claim that she and Todd have been dating since they were 11, which confuses Ramona because Envy had dated Scott and Todd had dated her since then. Envy dismisses this inconvenient counter-argument as fake news. Scott makes several ineffective attempts to fight Todd, interspersed with flashbacks to their time at college, where the same Julie who is now so keen to suck up to Envy really didn't care for her as a person, but she and Scott seem to hit it off. It leads to them dating for a few months and even forming a new band together, but Scott eventually gets an unfortunate silence to his first I love you. Envy eventually calls a halt to the fight because it's taking up too much of the comic and decrees they should continue the next day at a place called Honest Ed's. Kim and Steven Stills bounce, so Ramona and Scott go out for late night pizza, running into Wallace, who declares his everlasting hatred for Envy and also mentions he's met a guy called Mobile. Don't ask, his name never gets addressed, and wants to take him home, so Scott has to stay with Ramona. Ramona agrees, but reluctantly, as she's kind of pissed at Scott for ever having had poor enough taste to have dated someone like Envy, which seems a little unfair, but in her defense, Envy does have a way of bringing out the worst in everyone around her. Scott wakes up super early and decides to go home, forgetting that Wallace borrowed his keys the night before and getting trapped outside in the rain. When he finally discovers him, Wallace offers to show Scott a chi channeling technique that Mobile's taught him that removes water, apparently his new boyfriend has psychic powers, which is cool. There's more cutaways to the past that show that Natalie was either never really as nice as Scott remembers or went through her personality shift long before she got famous. You also see that Wallace became friends with Scott in exactly the same way that Lisa did, basically by just deciding to be a part of his life without really consulting him on the matter. The next day, both parties meet outside Honest Ed's and... I'll try to explain this, but I'm gonna level with you, I didn't really get this part of the book. Honest Ed's is, or was, a real thing in Toronto, a massive multi-story superstore that opened in 1948, spanning an entire city block. Apparently, it eventually became something of a tourist attraction because of its 23,000 lightbulb signs and amusing old-timey slogans like, "Come in and get lost," and "Only the floors are crooked." In the Scott Pilgrim universe, apparently the store's unbelievably low prices and extensive inventory cause the human mind to go haywire and either overload or shut down. Sort of? It has this effect on the comic's main characters, but you can clearly see a lot of bystanders in the store who are just trying to do their shopping. Anyways, Envy is a little vague about what Todd and Scott have to do to win, either just getting through the store or killing each other, and tells Todd not to use his vegan powers to do it. Once inside, both boys start immediately freaking out, and while they attempt to fight, they are both quickly overcome with the existential horror of the store. Todd's life starts flashing before his eyes, and you see that his father was rather hard on him, that Gideon personally recruited him into the League of Evil Exes, and that he's bonking the band's drummer behind Envy's back. Unable to stand it anymore, Todd unleashes his vegan powers and implodes the entire store. Scott is of the opinion this means he's the victor, but it's declared a draw. Fun fact, well, more just a fact, it's not actually that fun, this actually foreshadowed real life, as about 10 years after this comic's publication, the real Honest Ed's went out of business and was also demolished. The next chapter goes through some more not really main plot related character building stuff, like more band practices and Scott and Ramona going out for what looks like really good sushi. They're supposed to be going to meet Envy and Todd for another battle afterwards, but Ramona has finally thought to question why the fuck they're jumping through so many hoops for the League of Evil Exes, and Envy in particular, when none of this was their idea or something they wanted to do in the first place. They bail on the meetup and go for sexy fun times instead, but their past keeps haunting their minds and is a real mood killer. Ramona gives the backstory on Todd, describing how they only really dated because they were both douchey teenagers, and even though he punched a hole in the moon to prove his devotion to her, they still lost touch when he went to hone his abilities in Vegan Academy. Scott tries to talk about Envy's backstory, but Ramona isn't interested, asking about Kim instead. Scott reveals he can't really remember the events of the flashback we saw in Volume 2. The comic then briefly cuts to Knives crying at the top of a large billboard in what looks like the city's centre, then moves on to the next day and the Clash at Demon Head having lunch. Todd orders gelato for dessert, and while Envy is in the bathroom, reveals he is well aware it's made of milk and eggs, but doesn't give a fuck, believing he is above the need to remain vegan to keep his vegan powers because he's a rock star now. Then the reader is given a reminder that he's still cheating on Envy. There's more random stuff like Ramona giving Scott a haircut, and more flashbacks to Envy being a bit of a bitch to people and completely taking over the band they were in. Please excuse me for skimming over this stuff. I promise it works really well in the comic, but I fear it would sound somewhat boring if related back to you in detail. This is one of the reasons you really should read the comics if you haven't done so yet. The day finally arrives for Sexbomb to open for the Clash at Demon Head, which is apparently still happening despite their bass players attempts to kill each other. Bear with me here because a lot goes on in these pages, and none of it's really important, except that it totally is. Once again, Crash and the boys, who were not killed by a stray shot from Matthew Patel like in the film, are playing just before them. They appear to be known as the Boys and Crash now, and, confusingly, appear to no longer require the use of instruments to make music. Scott runs into Envy in the back alley, and she makes the unexpected request that they just talk like normal people for a bit, something he doesn't think is possible for several reasons. She warns him not to use her old name anymore, as she is all Envy now. He also spies Knives sitting all by her lonesome, and despite clearly being tempted to avoid her, he mans up and goes to check how she's getting on. She seems to have grown as a person as a result of the events of Volumes 1 and 2, except that she really hasn't, and as soon as Scott acknowledges that he treated her like crap, she forgives him and begs him to date her again. Meanwhile, Kim and Ramona are having a heart-to-heart, and Kim mentions she used to be really into this guy called Simon, but it didn't work out, so she ended up dating Scott pretty much out of convenience after that. The group then notices Todd and Lynette are making out in the corner, not the most subtle of infidelities. Sex Bob-omb go backstage to get ready to perform, and unfortunately Ramona and Envy then end up at the bar together. Envy once again continues her tirade of hurtful insinuations, even bringing up Ramona's mysterious most recent ex from New York, which finally pushes Ramona past breaking point and she attacks her with a hammer that she pulls out of an apparently bottomless handbag. Because she's famous, the crowd seems to be entirely on Envy's side in the battle, with the exception of Awesome Wallace, who is totally rooting for Ramona to break her smug face. Ramona gets some hits in, but Envy eventually gets the upper hand. In an unexpected development, Knives actually intercedes to try to help Ramona, mumbling that she just wants Scott to be happy. While they were fighting, Sex Bob-omb come on stage looking pretty darn good. Scott realizes that Ramona and Knives are in trouble, and after one last flashback where it's made clear that Natalie was totes cheating on him before dumping him, he rushes to save them, touching the back of Envy's leg, which incapacitates her temporarily. Ramona tries to tell Envy that Todd is cheating on her, but she refuses to believe it, angrily explaining that she and Todd had been lifelong star-crossed lovers, proven by Todd punching a hole in the moon for her. Ramona breaks it to Envy that Todd did this for her as well, and did it for her first, which is a shock revelation Envy can't just brush aside, though her more immediate concern quickly becomes Todd and Lynette coming back from a quickie with her underpants on his head. It's kind of amazing these chucklenuts managed to get away with their affair as long as they did, if this is how they go about it. Enraged, Envy attacks Lynette with Ramona's hammer. The drummer teleports away, but Envy manages to at least smash her biotic arm off before she escapes. Todd disarms her and tries to calm her down, but it seems she's finally decided to stop being manipulated, kneeing him in the junk. He loses his temper and hurls her across the room with his vegan powers. Scott intercedes, I guess in the process finally restarting their League of Evil Exes battle. He's thrown back, and in another unexpected development, the boys in Crash join the fight to help him. It turns out they've learned how to control sound itself, which is how they played without instruments. They use this to block Todd's attack and give Scott an opening, but it's still not enough. Scott realizes that without a Deus Ex Machina plot device he is doomed, and oddly enough his wish is immediately granted with the arrival of the vegan police. In the comics world there is apparently no three-strike system, so Todd is stripped of his powers then and there. Scott gives him the headbutt of death and is slightly weirded out to receive an extra life for his accomplishment. Knife suggests that Sex Bob-omb should probably still play so the night isn't a complete write-off for everyone. While they're performing, a mysterious gentleman in glasses who is watching the whole affair quietly slips out of the building. Afterwards, Scott and Envy share an awkward goodbye, and it's noted that Envy still owns one of Scott's hoodies, suggesting that perhaps he didn't quite mean as little to her as they both previously thought. Scott still doesn't consider this a particularly satisfying ending, but Ramona and Wallace cheer him up and the comic ends on a fairly optimistic note. There are two extra bonus stories at the end of the hardback color edition of the comics that I only learned about recently. One is about one of the exes, probably Roxy, making a bunch of movie posters come alive and attack Scott, which also contains the very amusing tidbit that in this video game themed world, sodas come with temporary stat boosts that are listed on the side of the bottle like nutritional information. The other is drawn in a slightly different art style and chronicles some examples of just how awful Kim's roommates are to live with. The Dom's final thoughts. There's enough of this comic in this part of the film that I have to assume they at least had a clear synopsis of the plot and some of the artwork to work with, but my goodness, there is a lot more left out of this volume section. The film pretty much took the beginning and some of the end of the book but tore out everything in the middle. However, once again, what did make it into the film wasn't inaccurate to the events of the comic by any means. There's still plenty of direct quotes and panel-perfect imagery on the screen. The only big exception to this being the way that Scott finally took down Todd, and once again I feel I have to side with the film's version of events as being superior. It just works better and is more satisfying with Scott taking an active part in Todd breaking his veganism instead of Todd, after apparently years of discipline, having willingly broken his diet for the first time right before their battle. Quite frankly, I think O'Malley kind of fell into the trap of believing that lampshading his lazy writing somehow stopped it from being lazy writing. Some of the abandoned elements of this book are repurposed for later parts of the film, most notably Ramona's hammer fight and the weak spot on the back of Envy's leg, but also things like her pre-nut kick, let's both be girls line. This is the first comic to focus more on the battle with the evil ex of the week and less on the Scott Knives Ramona love triangle, though you could make the case that's only because the love square that Scott finds himself in just happens to be tied into that. It also partakes in a slightly different method of storytelling, with the flashbacks interwoven throughout the book instead of having their own chapter like in Volume 2. I am not an expert on this subject, but I think this is something that's more common in the kind of manga that O'Malley took influence from. Regardless, the end result is this adaptation cut out almost as many flashbacks as the first few seasons of Game of Thrones. The Todd in the film might have been mistaken for just a big dumb brute, but gosh damn, the comic version of him is in the running for the biggest dickhead in the Americas. Zero fucks given about his destruction. Envy isn't so much changed as she is a extremely minimal representation of the character she was in the comic, where we got to see that her snooty, arrogant persona was really just a cover for a vulnerable person so desperate to believe in her fantasy about her perfect relationship she ignores pretty obvious evidence. I have to confess, as mean as she is in the comic, I still found it pretty grueling to see that come crashing down around her so hard and so suddenly. Because this is the last time we see her in the film, she's also missing the conclusion to her arc, as we will discuss in the review of the final volume, but they did at least include a hint in the film that she might be capable of human growth after these events. She seems to realise that she missed being known by her real name, and tells her sycophant to shut up instead of just basking in her worship like she did earlier. It's not much, but at least it's something. You don't really see enough of her and Todd's relationship in the film to know if they're as toxic for each other as they were in the book, or if he was cheating on her there too. I suppose it's entirely possible they just went back to dating after he respawned. While the storyline involving Honest Ed's was completely cut out of the film, you can see the store in the background of one of the scenes, opposite the pizza place where they recuperate. This Easter egg is one of the reasons I believe they did have most of this volume to work with when they were writing the script for the film. I might be imagining it, but I can't help but think that O'Malley ramped up the craziness of Scott Pilgrim's world in this volume, and it's not just more video game logic, although there was some of that too with the introduction of save points and Ramona's infinite inventory space. Ramona mentions that she attended the University of Carolina in the Sky, which is apparently a floating city chained to a mountain. Wallace starts dating a psychic who works a day shift in the astral plane, and one of Scott's friends apparently recently visited the future and acquired a cursed ring that he wears for funsies. This comic continues with the Scott has a terrible memory recurring joke, but hints there might be a darker reason behind it. Alright, spoiler warning, it eventually turns out there are several dark reasons behind it, but this one is like normal dark, not fantastical dark. Despite Scott's constant claims that he doesn't drink, he clearly does in several scenes and flashbacks, suggesting he's either a pathological liar or a blackout drunk who can't remember anything he does while intoxicated, including drinking. It was apparently so bad he didn't even know that he'd been dumped by Envy until Stephen Stills tells him. This section is one of the best parts of the film in my opinion, but in conclusion, I guess I still have to eat my words from the intro of this review. It looks like they really tried to stay loyal to this volume, but with so little time to get through it, it was impossible to still end up with the same message, feel, vibe, whatever. Too much was lost for me to be able to say that this was a successful adaptation. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers. The usual reminder that my channel will undoubtedly be devoured by the unspeakable Lovecraftian horror that is the YouTube algorithm if you don't like, comment, share, and subscribe, so no pressure there. See you soon. Hello again, my beautiful watchers. I just wanted to take this opportunity to give you a quick reminder that there's a wonderful website called Patreon that's been allowing online producers to actually make a living doing what they do, since apparently YouTube's decided that they shouldn't anymore. Basically, they offer the chance to pledge a certain amount of money per month or per video in exchange for various rewards offered by the creator. There's a variety of stuff you can earn by becoming one of my patrons, including early access to all videos and taking part in that survey you see at the start of every Lost in Adaptation episode. That's actually a very important part of the process, as I use it to gauge how much I'm going to need to explain about the book and the film before I start comparing them. If you decide to become a higher level contributor, your name will be added to the credits that you're seeing right now, and you'll be given the option to join my private chat room so you can regularly talk with me and other patrons. If you're keen enough to join the topmost tier of patronage, you'll earn the most coveted of all the rewards, the chance to pick a future adaptation to be reviewed by yours truly. However, if right now you are thinking, my goodness, the Dom, I can't do that. The Llama King will not allow it. The Llama King sees all.
Llama King cannot be opposed. The Llama King is everything.
Fear not, it would still be a huge help to me if you were to give that like button the old clickaroo, share this episode on social media with perhaps a little recommendation to your friends to check it out, and subscribe if you've not already. It really helps my channel grow and reach new beautiful watchers. I hope you have a most pleasant day, and I will see you in the next episode.